Welcome to Truth Behind History. If you're someone who loves uncovering the hidden forces that shaped our world, you've come to the right place. Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial and impactful figures of the 20th century, Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin wasn't just a dictator, he was a master strategist, a ruthless political player, and the architect of an economic vision that transformed the Soviet Union. But at what cost? In this video, we'll explore how Stalin rose to power, built his totalitarian rule, and implemented his Marxist-Leninist economic vision. We'll examine his policies, their consequences, and how they shaped not only the USSR but also the wider world. So, buckle up, this is going to be a fascinating, and at times, shocking journey into Stalin's rise and ideology. Stalin's path to absolute power was anything but straightforward. He wasn't the natural successor to Lenin, far from it. In fact, Lenin himself had serious doubts about Stalin, warning in his testament that he was too brutal. But did Stalin take that as a career-ending critique? Of course not. Instead, he played the long game, outmaneuvering his rivals one by one. The biggest threat? Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was a revolutionary mastermind, charismatic, and had the loyalty of the Red Army. But Stalin? He was patient, politically shrewd, and most importantly, he controlled the Communist Party's bureaucracy. That was his golden ticket. By the late 1920s, he had sidelined and eliminated major competitors like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Bukharin. Some were expelled, some were executed, and others, like Trotsky, were exiled, only to later meet an untimely end via an ice pick to the head in Mexico. That's a pretty strong way to say, you're not coming back. With his enemies gone, Stalin wasted no time tightening his grip on the Soviet Union. This wasn't just a dictatorship, it was a full-fledged totalitarian regime. Dissent? Not tolerated. Political opposition? Eliminated through purges and infamous show trials. Stalin mastered the art of fear. The Great Purge of the 1930s saw millions arrested on fabricated charges, many executed or sent to brutal labor camps in Siberia. The message was clear, loyalty wasn't optional. You either conformed or you disappeared. Stalin wasn't just about power, he had a vision. He believed in transforming the Soviet Union into a socialist powerhouse. How? Through rapid industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture. It was an economic revolution, but as we'll see, it came with devastating consequences. Before Stalin's radical reforms, the Soviet economy was struggling. Agriculture was outdated, industry was limited, and economic instability was rampant. Most of the USSR's farmers were still using techniques that had barely changed since the Middle Ages. This meant low agricultural productivity and frequent food shortages. Meanwhile, industry was confined to a few urban centers, and infrastructure was weak. The country simply wasn't equipped to compete with Western powers. And then, there was the instability, famines, inflation, and a lack of coherent economic planning left the Soviet Union stagnating. Stalin saw this as an opportunity to impose order and drive forward modernization. But his solutions? Well, they were drastic. Stalin's answer to economic backwardness? A centrally planned economy where the government dictated production targets. The centerpiece of this effort was the first five-year plan from 1928 to 1932. This wasn't just a bureaucratic initiative, it was an economic revolution. The goal? Rapid industrial growth, especially in coal, steel, and machinery production. Heavy industry was prioritized, even at the expense of consumer goods. That meant factories were churning out steel and tractors, but basic necessities like shoes and bread were often scarce. Did industrial output increase? Yes, significantly. But the downside? Unrealistic targets led to massive inefficiencies, poor working conditions, and worker exploitation. Factories prioritized hitting quotas over quality control, which meant a lot of what was produced was unusable. And if you failed to meet targets, you risked being labeled an enemy of the state. Now, Stalin wasn't just focused on industry. Agriculture was another battleground for his vision of the Soviet economy. Enter forced collectivization. Private farms were seized, and millions of peasants were forced onto massive state-run collective farms called kolkhozes. The government controlled production, distribution, and even what farmers were allowed to keep for themselves. Unsurprisingly, peasants weren't thrilled about this. Many resisted, leading to violent uprisings. Some even destroyed their own crops and livestock rather than hand them over to the state. The result? A disastrous decline in agricultural productivity, mass famine, and rural displacement. One of the darkest consequences of collectivization was the Holodomor in Ukraine, a man-made famine that killed millions. The Holodomor, meaning death by hunger, was one of Stalin's most brutal policies in action. When Ukrainian peasants resisted collectivization, Stalin retaliated by imposing grain requisitioning policies that left millions to starve. From 1932 to 1933, estimates suggest between 3 to 7 million Ukrainians perished from starvation and disease. But Stalin didn't just allow this to happen, his government actively denied it. International aid was blocked, discussion of the famine was suppressed, and those who spoke out were silenced or executed. Even today, the Holodomor remains a deeply controversial subject, with debates over whether it constitutes genocide. But one thing is certain, it was a catastrophe that could have been prevented. As Stalin's economic policies took hold, the Soviet Union underwent a rapid transformation, shifting from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse. This wasn't a slow evolution, it was an aggressive, top-down push that forced the country into modernization, whether it was ready or not. The focus was on heavy industry, steel, coal, and energy production. Stalin had no interest in consumer goods or improving daily life. What mattered was output, efficiency, and above all, power. Entire cities were reshaped to accommodate this industrial boom, with places like Magnitogorsk built practically from the ground up to serve as symbols of Soviet ambition. Workers were expected to meet impossible quotas, and factory conditions were often harsh, but the results were undeniable. By the late 1930s, Soviet industrial production had surged, rivaling that of some Western nations. This industrial expansion wasn't just about the economy, it was about war. Stalin knew that industrial strength was the backbone of military power, and with tensions rising across Europe, he made sure the Soviet Union was ready. Massive arms factories began churning out tanks, artillery, and aircraft, preparing for the conflicts he saw on the horizon. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had one of the largest standing armies in the world, though Stalin's paranoia led to the purging of many of his most experienced officers, a decision that would prove costly when World War II erupted. Industrialization also reshaped Soviet society. Millions of peasants left rural villages and moved to urban centers to work in factories, changing the social fabric of the nation. Cities became overcrowded, housing was scarce, and living conditions were tough, but for many, this was the only path to survival. The Soviet Union had entered the modern industrial age, but at an enormous human cost. Stalin's rapid industrialization may have propelled the Soviet Union forward, but it came with a terrifying side effect in an era of paranoia, purges, and repression that would define his rule. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had eliminated his political rivals, yet his grip on power was far from secure. At least, that's what he believed. Convinced that enemies lurked everywhere, he launched the Great Purge, a brutal campaign to rid the Soviet Union of anyone who could challenge his authority. Party officials, military leaders, intellectuals, and even ordinary workers were accused of treason, sabotage, or being enemies of the people. Many were subjected to show trials, public spectacles where defendants confessed to absurd crimes, often after torture or threats against their families. Those found guilty, which was almost always the case, faced execution or exile to the Gulag system, prison labor camps that became Stalin's dumping ground for perceived traitors. The gulags were a living nightmare. Prisoners toiled under extreme conditions, building railways, mining, and working in factories, often in freezing temperatures with little food. Mortality rates were high, and for many, a gulag sentence was a slow death sentence. But beyond the arrests and executions, Stalin's purges created something even more powerful: fear. People became afraid to speak openly, afraid to trust their friends, even afraid of their own family members. Children were encouraged to report their parents for anti-Soviet behavior, neighbors turned on neighbors, and a simple accusation could mean death. This wasn't just about eliminating political opposition, it was about control. Stalin had built an empire not just of industry and military might, but of terror. Stalin's influence didn't stop at the Soviet Union's borders. After World War II, much of Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, and with it came Stalinist policies, strict government control, centrally planned economies, and harsh political repression. Countries like East Germany, Poland, and Hungary were forced to adopt Stalin's economic model, prioritizing heavy industry and state-controlled agriculture. Just like in the USSR, private businesses were abolished, and the government dictated what should be produced, how much, and by whom. But this system had the same flaws: inefficiency, corruption, and frequent shortages of basic goods. It wasn't just the economy that followed Stalin's blueprint, his model of political control spread too. Secret police forces were established to root out opposition, propaganda dominated public life, and any criticism of the government was met with swift and brutal consequences. Leaders in these countries ruled with an iron grip, mirroring Stalin's methods of maintaining absolute power. For many in Eastern Europe, life under Stalinism meant a lack of freedom, economic hardship, and constant fear. While the Soviet Union had industrialized itself into a global superpower, its influence left behind a legacy of repression that would last for decades. Stalin's economic policies had undeniably transformed the Soviet Union into a global powerhouse, but this success came at a cost that would be felt for generations. In the short term, industrial output skyrocketed. The Soviet Union became a major player on the world stage, proving that rapid industrialization, even at an extreme human cost, could create a formidable state. The USSR's ability to mass-produce steel, coal, and weaponry allowed it to compete with Western powers and later stand toe-to-toe with the United States during the Cold War. But in the long run, Stalin's centrally planned economy proved unsustainable. Without incentives for efficiency or innovation, the system began to crack. Factories met quotas by cutting corners, infrastructure aged without proper maintenance, and consumer goods remained scarce. By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet economy was stagnating, weighed down by inefficiency and a bloated bureaucracy. Beyond the Soviet Union, Stalin's economic model influenced many socialist states, with varying results. Some, like Mao's China, took Stalinist policies even further, while others, like Eastern European nations, struggled under the burden of central planning. In most cases, economies built on Stalinist principles eventually collapsed under their own inefficiencies, reinforcing the lesson that an economy ruled by force rather than market forces cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Stalinism left a mark on the world that cannot be ignored. It reshaped the Soviet Union's economy, military, and society, while also influencing socialist movements across the globe. But what are the key lessons we can take from this era? First, Stalin's policies undeniably turned the Soviet Union into a major global power. His rapid industrialization allowed the USSR to compete with Western nations and helped it withstand the Nazi invasion during World War II. However, this success was built on suffering. Millions of lives were lost to purges, forced labor, and famine, showing the devastating consequences of absolute state control. Second, the economic system Stalin created simply wasn't sustainable. While industrial growth was impressive in the short term, inefficiency, corruption, and a lack of market incentives led to stagnation in the decades that followed. This rigid model contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, proving that economic control at such an extreme level is ultimately self-destructive. Finally, Stalinism serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. When a single leader consolidates control through fear and repression, the consequences ripple through every aspect of society. Stalin's rule not only shaped the USSR but set a precedent for authoritarian governments around the world, many of which followed his example, often with equally disastrous results. So, what do you think? Was Stalin's rule a necessary evil for Soviet progress, or was it an unforgivable reign of terror? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out my other videos on truth behind history. There's plenty more to uncover. See you in the next one.